We will now move on to the policy roundtable on water. The topic for discussion is very interesting and timely, is interlinking of rivers the way to solve India's water woes. I'll invite Mr. Joy to take a seat. Dr. Sharat Chandra Lele will be moderating this session. Dr. Lele is a senior fellow and the convener for the Center for Environment and Development at ATRI, and he's an ambassador of interdisciplinarity through his research and teaching, which straddles ecology, economics, and political science. I would now like to introduce our panelists and invite them onto the stage. Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni is the founder, trustee, and executive director, Advanced Center for Water Resources and Development, Aquadam, in Pune. His research work has attempted to create a space, both in practice and policy, on the importance of the science of groundwater, and he believes that aquifer-based participatory groundwater development can imbibe the principles of commons in both practice and policy. Dr. Kulkarni has experience spanning over nearly 30 years and is actively involved in the advocacy of stronger programs on groundwater management in India. He was the chairman of the Working Group on Sustainable Groundwater Management for India's 12th five-year plan. Dr. Kulkarni is currently working on groundwater management in different hydrogeological typologies in India. Dr. Laila Mehta is a professional research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, and a visiting professor at Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Her research has focused on water and sanitation and the politics of environment development and sustainability. She studies issues concerning knowledge, power, rights, and access to natural resource management. Her recent projects have addressed peri-urban dynamics, the politics of integrated water resources management in Africa, and climate change in India. She is currently the Water and Sanitation Domain Convener of the STEPS Center. Professor Brij Gopal is a coordinator, Center for Inland Waters in South Asia. An aquatic ecologist by training, he received a PhD degree in plant ecology from Banaras Hindu University in 1968. He retired as Professor of Environmental Science at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2009. Professor Gopal was the first recipient of the Science Academy Medal for Young Scientists way back in 1974. He was awarded the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship for Postdoctoral Studies, the Max Planck Institute of Limnology, Germany, and was visiting professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. He has received several prestigious awards, including the Norman Thiemann Medal of the International Association of Limnology and the International Fellow Award of the Society of Wetland Scientists. Thank you. Welcome, all of them on stage.
Thank you, Jagdish. I'll add my words of welcome to the members of this panel, Dr. Laila Mehta, Professor Brij Gopal, and Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni. Thank you for accepting our invitation. This is the last, but I would definitely say not the least of the discussions and debates that we will have in this conference, because as you know, this is just a way of sparking some thoughts in this audience that will continue even after the meeting is over. Somebody mentioned in the previous panel discussion that we didn't really have much of a discussion because everybody was on the same side. And we didn't have the foresters in the room, so we didn't have much of a hot and interesting kind of debate. We might be in a somewhat similar boat in this case, so I decided that I'll pull out my BTech engineering credentials from IIT Bombay and be probably the hidden engineer that I've always been while roaming around with a gloss of interdisciplinarity. So I thought I'll play the advocate for interlinking of rivers, at least in the beginning, to set up the whole discussion and then see where we can go from there. We had originally planned to have a series of questions and discussions around each question and so on. What I'll do, however, is also in the interest of time, pose the three questions that I had in mind and then request the panelists to take a stab at each of them or whichever one they would like to focus on as an initial round of responses, and then maybe we can revisit some of those questions and eventually open it up to the audience. So I'd just like to give a little bit of a background as to why we chose this topic. Is interlinking of rivers the solution to India's water woes? I think all of you will agree, and Veena repeated this in her presentation. Dr. Upamanyu Lal said the same thing earlier before that we are a water scarce country, and there's no denying that. The conventional solution to solving our water problems is to build dams, because we need storage between the monsoon and into the summer. That's point number one. And we need storage between surplus years and drought years. That's point number two. So that's been the kind of rationale behind building bigger and bigger dams. As our ability to build those dams has grown, we have justified it by saying we will irrigate larger areas, we will make water more secure for an increasing population and so on. But as part of that, we've also been saying that, and it really came home to me when I went to visit the Sardar Sarovar Dam when it was under construction, that it is really an engineer's dream. It's an engineer's dream to engineer the whole landscape and even take water 1,000 kilometers into some kind of an incredibly dry and arid region of Kutch. So it really fulfills the engineer's vision of being able to manipulate soil, water, air, whatever you want, to with the use of technology to meet human needs. And so we have made this argument that, for instance, it's not that the debate has stopped after the Sardar Sarovar controversy died down. In fact, after that controversy died down, because if eventually the Supreme Court gave clearance to continue the dam, we have the whole interlinking of rivers idea coming up again. And unfortunately, it was the Supreme Court that started the ball rolling by sort of resuscitating that idea of interlinking across the whole Indian subcontinent. But if we look at the situation, and here I live in Bangalore, we are already drawing from water from the river Kaveri, which is 100 kilometers away. And it is not enough. The rate at which Bangalore is growing, the Bangalore Water Supply Board is already wanting 3 other projects to meet Bangalore's projected needs over the next 15 years. And so they are looking at the Yatinhole project as one such source of water. The Yatinhole is a stream that contributes to the Netravati River. For those of you who don't know this geography, the Netravati is a west-flowing river from the Western Ghats. Bangalore is on the far to the east of the Western Ghats. We are 200 kilometers away from the origins of this river. And the plan is to divert water that is west-flowing into the eastern side of the plateau and supply water amongst other places in the name of drinking water to Tumkur and Kolar and so on. So the water will be really distributed across a variety of cities and towns and villages. But the justification is that this region is water scarce. The Netravati water flows waste into the Arabian Sea. So we need to be able to make better use of the water. The same argument is for the Mahadai. So the Mahadai water is going into Goa and ending up in the Arabian Sea, again seen as a surplus basin, and the Malaprabha as a deficit basin needs that water. So there's been the argument for bringing the Mahadai water into Malaprabha. So small examples of interlinking. In this case, either it's interlinking or interbasin transfers or just big dams. So my first question actually to the panel is it actually useful to focus on the idea of interlinking per se? Is it better to focus on the question of interbasin transfers? Is it better to focus just on this old metaphor of big dams and say that that's the problem and the solution lies elsewhere? So which of these is a better way of framing the problem? That's one of my first question. My second question is, what are the different critiques of these large proposals? I mean, even as putting on my engineer's hat, I tremble at the idea of building another Sardar Sarovar Dam to displace another 500,000 people and submerge 40,000 hectares of land and so on and so forth. But we are still, in a sense, dreaming of that. As engineers, I think we are still dreaming of those kinds of interventions. And the dreams are only growing as we see the power of technology increasing every day. So my question is, what are the critiques of these kinds of interventions in the hydrological cycle of this subcontinent? And the third question that follows from the Sangharsh to the Nirman is, what might be the alternatives that you could suggest as ways of thinking about it? Do we need to change the way we are thinking about this? Are there changes required elsewhere in governance, in the rights of people downstream of these so-called wasteful, west-flowing or water surplus rivers? What is really the way ahead in this whole debate? So I'll pose all the 3 questions, and I'll start from Himanshu and request, we'll go in this direction, requesting the panelists to respond to the questions.
So thanks, Sharad. I think it's a difficult job opening the batting. And like you've come back like the pair of Lilly and Thompson. At one time, they were a threat to the entire cricketing world. So anyway, let me try and answer not all of your questions, but like you said, conveniently look at maybe question number 3, which is in terms of the alternatives. And in that, I'd maybe quickly make 2 or 3 points. So I think the entire notion of surplus and deficit itself, to my mind, is flawed. It's flawed because what you earlier said, that when we look at water, and this is not just about surface water. I mean, a lot of the documents that have emerged from within the formal system of government, whether it's the state or the center, look at 2 very interesting words. One is water flowing waste to the sea. And this is also an argument that is made with groundwater, that there are estimates of groundwater flows that go and join the sea, and these are called wasted water. One of the things I learned from K.R. Date, because Joy brought it up, was Dr. Date never believed in the word losses. So I think waste and losses as a part of the system, and I think increasingly the state also acknowledges that river basins are systems, and the entire closure of river basins is a systemic approach. So I actually see a paradox in the principles of the principles of the for and against argument in the river linking process. So I think as a part of the critique itself, I think the principles themselves need to be restated. My second, which, I said I'd begin with the alternatives. And I think as a part of that, I'd just like to make 2 or 3 points. I think the entire discourse on surplus and deficits is built on the principle of estimating availability and looking at demand. And if you look at, I think even some of the earlier presentations brought this out, that there is a tendency to overestimate our availability. I think Veena's presentation talked about double estimates or overestimates. So there's an overestimation of availability on one side and actually an underestimate of the demand on the other side. And this itself creates a system or it creates an understanding of coming in with a very supply side or supply oriented approach to the entire problem of water in India. And I think the large dams, the river linking program is embedded in this approach of supply side interventions. What we need, and I think there are, by alternatives I mean there are actually a lot of success stories on the ground. Most of these are very, very local, decentralized, and fairly, scaled. I mean, they might be in different locations, but if you actually aggregate these alternatives together, I will not go into the alternatives. But I think there are these success stories, and I think Joy alluded to some of them, which are really going to be the alternative, sort of the alternative set of solutions for large projects. What is missing? For me, what is missing from this discourse is the story of groundwater. And again, I see a paradox there, that on the one hand, if you look at all the previous presentations, I think with 3 speakers, when they made a reference to India, India is the largest user of groundwater in the world, but it probably has the largest number of dams. And I think the groundwater story is entirely missing in this debate on for and against river linking. And I think that is the largest blind spot that I can think of in this debate itself. Maybe if there's time, I'll come back to this a little later.
Let me thank Atri on their 20th anniversary for organizing this panel discussion and inviting me, and I thank Sharad for persuading me to be part of this discussion. Of course, for past few years, I have got myself involved into the controversy of river linking based on my personal investigations into the so-called first link. the very question of river linking, and as the government says, we have formulated 30 links, and Ken-Betwa will be the first link in that program. And as we hear, already other links are being talked about at some different stage of this. Firstly, the government, which swears by river linking as the solution for all the problems, perhaps, of food security and water security, forgets that the link, Satluj-Yamuna link, which was inaugurated by Mrs. Gandhi and had been constructed except for a 2-kilometer or so stretch, has not been completed and has been at the center of a constitutional crisis. The same people who were present at the inauguration have been in power now. Those who opposed are also in power. Those who swear by river linking are also in power. And they are all opposing the completion of the link. If Satluj-Yamuna link cannot be completed for the water security of Haryana, then why and how can we get with other links where also interstate disputes will be there? Our Honorable Minister for Environment said recently, after taking over charge of the Ministry of Environment, let this first link be an experiment, and after 10 years, we shall see whether the other links should be taken up or not after studying. Where are the baseline data? Without any baseline data today, let the project be taken, which will take 10 years to complete, and then 10 years to see the impacts, and then by then everything will be forgotten. There have been many experiences of long interbasin transfers. Buckingham Canal, which does not function now anymore. There has been Indira Gandhi Canal taking water from Punjab into Rajasthan, and this is documented that what a misery, a disaster it brought to parts of western Rajasthan where malaria became epidemic. And of course, we have been talking about the Sardar Sarovar Dam and the water getting transferred. The problems are already emerging and the dam is not yet completed. This is also inter-basin transfer, though a link is not involved. So there may be a link between the two rivers is something different. When you put the water of one river into another river, a major tributary or a river, or it is just the water which is transferred into another river basin, or the water is transferred to the same basin, like the old Ganga, Yamuna canal systems which were irrigating fields in the same basins. So these are very different issues with different consequences. I'm mentioning them because whether we should allow for transfer of water from the river, whether with the help of a big dam or a small dam or so, that's another issue to be discussed. If we create one dam on a river, that river will be affected. But when we take the water from that one river to another and put it into that, the other river will also be affected, not only in its hydrology, in its ecology, and its socio-economics of the basin. Everything will be changed. So that have not been looked into, how the river systems will behave, how the biota will behave, how the river ecology will behave, and how the people in that basin. As long as people talk only of water in quantitative terms in case of transfers, linking, we are talking only of the quantities of water, so many MCM will be transferred from here to there and to there. In all other cases, it is only MCMs of water and nothing more is talked about. There is submergence, and for any amount of submergence of the land or dislocation of the people, there is always a monetary solution. I myself found out in the field, people were happy if the government, instead of offering 18 lakhs per acre, is willing to offer 50 lakhs, we will leave. It is just making money. What they will do with 50 lakhs and where they will go is perhaps not known to even them. That is the kind of situation. He asked another question, the solutions. What we have been doing before these mega engineering projects came, before we started with the Bhakra, the temples, modern temples of India. Were there no water storages created? In the same Gujarat, we had India's oldest reservoir created, the oldest man-made lake existed in Gujarat. Earlier also, we had canal systems and transferring water for irrigation, but who created those hundreds of thousands of tanks and farm ponds throughout, which sustained increase, but our cropping patterns have changed, our demands have changed, and our pressures on the water resources have changed. But much more than we forget the linkages between water, land, nature, and the total ecosystem. We forget about the water cycle, and as Himanshuji will say, the groundwater, surface water, but we have also to take into consideration the atmospheric water, the water in the soil. They are equally important. We have made it a point. And when someone talks about the possibility of cloud seeding to invoke some water, do they recognize that from where these clouds were formed? Were they coming directly from the Indian Ocean, or these water vapors went up from the landmass or the vegetation also? When we talk of water for irrigation and the equity among the people, we should also talk of the equity for non-human stakeholders and what do they provide us. The kind of ecosystem services in this two-day conference, we heard the ecosystem services a lot. When we do of those ecosystem services of the forests, of the grasslands, of the grazing lands, or any other ecosystems, are they not beneficial to us? Are they not important to the issues of climate change? And are the values of those ecosystem services that the water provides through all those non-human stakeholders ever taken into the cost-benefit analysis of these projects? I will not be harping only on that the fish biodiversity will decrease by 10% or 2 species will become extinct or the production will go down, but we look at the totality of all the ecosystem services which will be important. Going waste to sea, there are publications from many scientists, not me, which clearly show that the frequency of the cyclonic storms in the Bay of Bengal is increasing because of the change in salinity during the past 40 years. The inflows of fresh water into the coastal areas are causing the decline of the mangroves, and we harp on restoration of mangroves with only one species and say that mangroves will provide us security. Mangroves will not be there if there will not be fresh water flowing into the sea. The fisheries, coastal fisheries, on which the thousands and thousands of fishermen all along the India's coasts survive, their livelihoods will not exist if the fresh water does not go into the sea. Today, as just was presented this morning by Professor Lal, in America, since 76, no new dam has been constructed. They are even trying to demolish some of them. Are we going to follow suit after another 40 years? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Brijgopal. Professor Mehta.
Thank you so much. Happy birthday, Trey, and thank you very much for inviting me. And congratulations, Thanks. Joy. I'll address 2 of the questions. So I'll address the problems and I'll address, the ways forward. So I think being at the end of a very long and exciting day means that lots of stuff has already been said. But I guess I just want to say one thing. Whether it's interlinking or large dams or whatever, intra-basin transfer, I think we're talking about a certain top-down intervention where technology is often seen as a solution. Technology is not seen as something that's neutral. And so these things are seen as outside of politics. And I want to challenge that because these are deeply political interventions. They may be also masculinist interventions with a kind of command and control kind of thing. It's supply-oriented, as we've already heard. So the idea is to augment water. So this is kind of based on a slightly flawed understanding of water scarcity. I've spent a lot of time in my career trying to understand different aspects of scarcity. So scarcity can be something that's physical, and it's often actually seen as something that's volumetric, but actually scarcity has many dimensions. There's economic scarcity, and people then try and solve it by issues of demand and pricing. But more importantly, I think scarcity is something that's socio-political, that's socially mediated. It's a question of access, it's a question of distribution. And until we start addressing these issues upfront, the water crisis is actually a crisis of access, of exclusion, of inequality. And if we don't address those issues upfront, we're never going to get anywhere. So I would say that a lot of these interventions actually naturalize the issue of scarcity, and they think that technology can actually solve the problem. The displacement issue has already been addressed. Interlinking of the rivers will probably cause 1.5 million people to be displaced. I first started out my work in development and environment as a young student looking at displacement in the Narmada Valley, deeply inspired by the activists. In fact, Kalpana and I were talking about those days when the journalists and academics and activists and villagers all got together and really dreamt of another world. And people are still displaced. People still haven't been resettled. So how the hell are people going to achieve new displacements? In displacement, we're also talking about a very narrow framing of assets and loss. And if you do that way, if you don't capture common property resources, if you don't capture non-monetary issues that really matter to people, the kind of suffering is really going to increase. A lot of these projects lead to very uneven costs and benefits. The same winners remain winners, and the same losers remain losers. And we really haven't come to that point of the World Commission on Dams, which really wanted the hitherto losers to become winners. I would say that moving on from, if you look back at the Narmada debate, there was a very strong state. Now we have new kids on the block, and that's why we're talking about water grabbing, which is not just about state control over water, but it's also about private and capitalist players. So a lot of these dams, a lot of these infrastructure projects have water now diverted to corporate actors. And that's done together with the nexus of the state, of bureaucrats, others. And so this can obviously, I think this will continue with projects like that. There's the issue of rivers. Rivers are unpredictable. There's climate change. We don't really understand. Downscaling the impacts of climate change at the local level is very difficult to understand. To really understand what's going to happen when you divert these rivers. You've already spoken about some of the impacts on the coast. Alone in Bharuch from the Narmada dams, there's been a lot of changes with sea ingress, salinity, etc. Engineers, IIT engineers are dreaming of distant Kutch. I've done my PhD in Kutch. Kutch has got very, very little of the water. And in some ways, Kutch has been waiting for that water, was waiting. Now I think Kutch is moving on. But waiting for that water meant not really looking at many, many alternatives. And I think a lot of these projects encourage a kind of post-truth kind of world. Gujarat wasn't that world around the Narmada, an exaggeration of benefits, of time, of cost overruns, and I think all this will happen. So these projects are loved by corporates, by contractors, by politicians. And I think we're talking about a very wicked problem that cannot be solved by something that's simple. So it's not really addressing the root problem of scarcity. So all those maps we saw earlier today, with due respect to people who produce them, all those red hotspots, they don't really tell us about what's happening on the ground. They don't really address issues of gender inequality, social inequality, and exclusion. And the fact that there are very skewed issues around access to water, even in drought-prone areas. Why are some people growing sugarcane, whereas other people are walking miles for water? So ways forward now, if I can have 1 minute. So obviously, to go beyond this technocentric kind of perception, so we need new imaginaries, we need new understanding. So this would mean, I guess, reframing the problem. So reframing how we understand scarcity, reframing the way we look at drylands, reframing the way we look at wastelands. There was a panel this morning that spoke about livestock in drylands and the fact that we really need to understand and reframe these questions of inefficiency, etc. We've heard a lot in this conference about cropping patterns, about procurement, about shifting, about focusing more on nutrition and achieving things like that. Rain-fed farming, revitalizing that, using supplementary irrigation when necessary. I think the biggest thing for me is, first sort out basic access. We in India and globally, there is a huge problem around basic access to water. Why is it that women are still walking 2 hours for water or 4 hours for water? It is basically a crime. I mean, no kind of act of terrorism equals the scale of devastation around the problems of water and sanitation in the world. When you look at the diarrheal deaths, when you look at 2,000 babies dying daily, but we're immune to this. Sort that issue out first. I think that is the priority. Sorting out people's basic rights to water and food. I think that should be the first priority before one thinks about some of these other things. Obviously, there are other things like innovative plant and livestock breeding. I was the team leader of a global report on water for food security and nutrition, and we tried to explore a lot of these alternatives, the linkages between water, food, and land, the fact that one can actually really look at existing structures, operation and maintenance, revitalize them, look at questions of drainage, link questions of blue and green water. Why do we separate out these issues? They're very, very interconnected. So similarly, when we talk about the nexus is not just up there, and the nexus is in everyday people's lives, so I think we need to join those things up, really bring together people's rights to water and food, and obviously prioritize local people's access and entitlements rather than the entitlements of powerful actors. And finally, I think one needs to embrace uncertainty. We always try and control it. We try and master it. So we want to control the river. We want to control systems. The question is to embrace uncertainty in multiple ways. For that, we need to challenge framings. We need to look at things in different ways. And I think there may be something about hybrid knowledges and hybrid solutions, really bringing together, maybe you've embodied that in your work, trying to bring together the so-called expert knowledge with so-called local understandings with that of the middle, activists, academics, and trying to create these kind of hybrid, maybe clumsy solutions, but these are kind of ways forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharad. And I think quite a bit of things have been already said, and I broadly also agree with what Leila pointed out as part of this whole debate. I think in the entire interlinking debate, quite a bit of things have been already written and said. Now, if you read writings of Professor Iyer, Vaidyanathan, Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, Himanshu Thakkar, even Professor Brij Gopal himself, I think there are, the whole critique against this gigantic project called ILR is anyway out there. I think people have looked at it from the ecological perspective, economic perspective, the whole issue of displacement and the type of social disruption it can cause and type of things. And we also have been saying that this is going to be what we call a mother of all conflicts. We also need to look at from the lens of conflicts and contestations in this, because there are various layers of conflicts actually embedded in this. There could be interstate conflicts coming up, and it's already there out. Bihar, which is supposed to be a so-called surplus state, is already saying, we have no water to share. Similarly, Odisha has taken a standard type of thing. And whether it is around large dams or inter-basin transfers or interlinking of rivers, I think this whole conflict angle is something which we need to engage with and think. So interstate is one. Second, the whole issue of allocation. Even if you transfer water from one basin to the other or link different things, where is ultimately this water going to use? Is it going for industries, agriculture, what type of agriculture, and also is it going to create water security for people in terms of basic drinking water and sanitation needs, as well as livelihood needs, and move in that order and type of thing. There is no discussion around these gigantic projects, around these all basic issues and things. So I feel that, and also conflicts around the large dams, for example, displacement and submergence. I think this is an issue even after maybe 60, 70 years of this, we have been able to settle these issues. Koyna Dam, which was built probably, 50, 60,
56.
70 years back, which is actually has been the power which, provided Mumbai, that type of industrial look. Probably there are about 30% of the people who are still moving from village to village without proper rehabilitation. So this is our story. And if Sardar Sarovar project is going to displace 300,000 or 400,000 people, and here I think it will be a multiplier of I don't know how many times going to be. So I think there are serious issues which are there. Second, I think reframing this whole issue, whether it is an interstate or dams or other type of thing, is not going to give us a handle to engage with this issue type of thing. I think there are problems at multiple levels. I mean, this whole question of surplus and deficit, one way of looking at it is at a philosophical level, saying that is there anything called surplus and deficit in terms of things? There is nothing like that. But I think on a more grounded fashion, we also need to disaggregate this whole concept of surplus and deficit. Now, surplus doesn't mean that the entire population of a particular basin have been able to meet all their basic needs, including drinking water, livelihood water, and other type of cultural and social other type of needs. And also what Brij Gopal just said about the non-human needs, whether it is animals, plants, ecosystem needs and type of thing, then we term a basin as surplus. I don't think any study of that type has been carried out in any of these links which are talking about. And what is deficit? In fact, the entire inequitable access to water which is being played out. I mean, Maharashtra is a classic example. I mean, Maharashtra is supposed to have the highest number of large dams in the country. Now, if you look at the whole irrigation, in the conventional parlance, I think we are not been able to irrigate more than 16 to 17% of the total cropped area. And 50% of that come from groundwater and things. Now, if that's the case, then I don't think we need to critically look at some, I mean, the last 2 years have been a continuous years of drought. In fact, for the first time we heard about water trains. You know, from Sangli and Meerut train going to Latur and other type of things. So this is the type of things we are talking about. There are more substantial issues I think we need to settle as a society before we getting into some of these issues and things. In fact, during the Sardar Sarovar debate, there was an interesting debate which was taking place. I don't know, some of you might know about Dr. Patel from Baroda, who is a geohydrologist, who said that the service area of the so-called Sardar Sarovar project has the capacity to absorb around 3 to 4 times of SSPs in its own belly, I mean the groundwater. If you can use some of this water to recharge without going for larger structures and type of thing, then there is a larger case. The evaporations and that type of thing which takes from the larger bodies, as she said, there is different types of water. This whole preoccupation with storage. In fact, I think the World Bank report also talks about per capita storage as the indicator of water security, which is, I don't think that holds true, which is an argument to hold for larger dams and other type of things. That they come back in China, the per capita storage is so much, in the US it is so much, and India is only so little, so we need to go for larger structures. And I think in situ water storages, where the crops and the vegetation take water directly from the soils, how do we improve that? I mean, the entire watershed-based activity is supposed to improve the soil, the moisture holding capacity of the soil. Or biomass as a storage of water. And different types of vegetation have got a capacity to deal with dry conditions, type of thing in a much more biological manner. So unless we explore some of these questions and type of thing and saying that storage, whether through large dams is the way out, probably may not see us through. One of the final comments about alternative. I think there are quite a few isolated cases out there where people have demonstrated that we can manage our lives with local water systems, by and large. I mean, there are small sub-basins and type of thing where probably the availability is so little. I'm talking about water, rainfall regimes maybe below 200 millimeter a year and type of thing. In Maharashtra, there are small sub-basins and things. So I think the main thing is we need to accept as a society is that the principle of subsidiarity. I mean, we seem to start from the top, saying that we bring water from outside and then to manage. And I don't think, I mean, the watershed reviews, which many of us have done, show that we have not been able to manage our own micro watersheds in a more equitable and sustainable manner. I think we need to start from the bottom. So, in terms of subsidiarity, if a lower hydrological unit can meet all your needs, then I don't think we need to bring in water from outside. Only in those cases where there is a problem, then probably you can have small transfers maybe from the intra-basin in terms of, within a basin, probably the rainfall is equal. And things like Krishna is a classic example where the western side of the basin get much more rainfall than the eastern part. So there are some small transfers which are taking place. But then this has to be justified through water balance studies and matching water availability with your priority needs and livelihood needs and type of things. In fact, the moment the water comes from outside as exogenous resource, it has been displacing and destroying the local systems. And this has been case, throughout the country. Maharashtra, we have so many traditional irrigation systems, whether it's the FUD system and or the type of diversion of small channels which farmers make every year and type of things have been all displaced and destroyed because we have been bringing water from outside to substitute the local system and not regenerate the local water regimes. So I would say there are many examples which we can draw to build this argument further.
Thanks, Joy. Before we open it up for this, questions from the floor, I'd just like to do a couple of points of pushback, keeping my hat on as the engineer in the room. So my first pushback is on the question of groundwater, and this is directed to Himanshu partly, that when we say groundwater is missing, so if you look at the history of the big dam controversy and then the evolution of groundwater-based irrigation in India, it sort of is that, as big dams became more and more unfashionable because of protest, because of resettlement issues and so on and so forth, groundwater irrigation actually took off in the starting in the 70s, but really in the 80s. And we are now the biggest groundwater irrigation country in some sense. So, but what do we see there? So if big was bad, if big dams were bad because they were big and they caused so much displacement, you could also say that the small or micro, which is what a borewell is terrible, because it has our experience with borewells is at the other extreme, you've got millions of overexploitation rather than one case of overexploitation. So the dams provide us a nice thing to shoot at because it's a huge structure and you can see the consequences very easily, whereas the millions of actors who are pumping groundwater without any kind of regulation constitute a different kind of an exploitation that is hidden or below the radar. So my pushback on that question is really, if big is bad, micro also seems to be bad. We don't seem to have the capacity to put in those regulations. Are you optimistic about now, especially after 30 years of unregulated pumping of groundwater, are you really optimistic about being able to bring regulation in? Or would it still make sense to focus only on surface water structures because they are civil engineering structures that you can perhaps control the gates from which the water is released? That's my first attempted pushback. My second pushback is at the question of ecosystem flows or environmental flows is, if we look at a pristine river basin with sort of minimal human interventions on the agricultural side, which is the primary sort of evapotranspirative component in the system, you would have a certain amount of flow to the estuary and then out to the ocean. And that will set up a certain kind of ecosystem in motion in those areas. The moment we talk about a population which goes from 30 crores at the turn of independence to 130 crores now, we're talking about an increased demand for food, and therefore we are talking about a quadrupling of the evapotranspirative demand in the agricultural sector. Setting aside the industrial sector as still a minor player in the larger picture. So I guess the question is, if you cannot deny the fact of population growth, how do we then set limits to what constitutes the what should be the minimum environmental flows that should be maintained in these rivers? Are there ways of actually arriving at that, or are we then going to be on some kind of a sliding scale where there's no particular point at which we can stop, given that consumptive use has increased tremendously compared to the say 70 years ago? And my third pushback is to Professor Mehta on the question of setting right the inequalities, say within the household, within the community, when water is actually supplied. As you said, women are still walking 2 kilometers to fetch water, whereas irrigation water is going to the fields at the same time. And so my response to that is, are these orthogonal in some sense? In the sense that any time you supply water to a community or any natural resource, we were talking about forests in the morning, is brought to, or people are given access to a natural resource, the existing inequalities within that society are going to get mirrored in the way that particular resource is accessed. But if the question is of getting them from 25 liters per capita per day to 50 liters, if possible, to sort of cross some kind of a threshold, would you wait for these inequities to be rectified, or would you focus on the supply question or the access in a physical sense of actually increasing availability of water even to the household? And the related question being that domestic use of water is still a very small player in the big picture, and that the biggest consumer, especially consumptive use of water, is in the agricultural sector. So how does rectifying gender inequalities within the home address the question of the intersectoral demand and competition for water between agriculture, domestic, and industry? So I'm going to request these three panelists to kind of respond to these questions and then open it up to the floor.
So, just 3 points of response, Sharad. So first, yes, I think one acknowledges that the problem or the crisis of groundwater is perhaps as big or as difficult or as challenging as the crisis of large dams. But I think the crisis itself is not sufficiently recognized. You know, that was my earlier point. However, having said that, I think it's much easier, although I would say it is significantly challenging, but it's probably much more practical, let me put it that way, of engaging with groundwater management or groundwater issues through a decentralized approach than it is with surface water. And I think it's much more easier to engage with people, communities, when you deal with groundwater. And I think our own experience, along with the experience of about 6 or 7 other partners in India, has shown that if you bring aquifers and people together, you can actually address the question of groundwater through a participatory, community-based, resource-centric approach to groundwater management. And I think there is hope there. There's perhaps more hope there because it's a significantly decentralized approach. Having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that the crisis of groundwater itself is not just a crisis of depletion. It's also a crisis of diversity and scale. So groundwater depletion in hard rock areas and groundwater depletion in the Indo-Gangetic alluvial systems are 2 different sets of problems. But I think dealing with the problem is going to be far more easier, let me put it that way, than actually dealing with the large dams. And I think with groundwater, you can actually connect with people more easily. Even experience in urban areas, and I mean even in places like Bangalore or some other cities, has shown that there's promise in that. I'd just like to sort of, end, like I said, there are 3 points. I think I also want to bring in the point of sort of aquifers and ecosystems into play. Most people believe that if you have rivers, your aquifers are intact. And I think aquifers have a far greater role to play in ecosystems than what is made out to be. Let me just give you a parting shot. I think there are 3 approaches where groundwater management is concerned. One is the question of participatory groundwater management, where you bring aquifers and people together. The second is mountains and mountainscapes, where groundwater is completely ignored because the Central Groundwater Board, for instance, does not assess groundwater in areas which have more than 20% slope. All the springs, or a majority of springs in this country, 2 to 3 million springs in this country, are in areas which have more than 20% slope. Where do you account for that groundwater? So spring water management, for instance, in the catchment areas, PGWM in the more conventional aquifers areas. And I'd like to end with the fact that nobody looks at the connection between groundwater and rain-fed agriculture. There is a connection there. And I think prioritizing, bringing in an additional priority. So we have drinking water, then we have agriculture, or even within agriculture, we have drinking water, rabi irrigation, summer irrigation. Where is the role of water? Where is the role of securing critical irrigation for rain-fed crops? So the blue water, green water interface, I think, is also an element of the larger question of groundwater management. So I think bringing this somewhat unconventional aspects into the groundwater management framework is really going to be the alternative to what is proposed as the larger centralized solution.
Thanks, Himanshu.
I think this issue of ecosystem services and environmental flows and the increasing population that you have raised, they are certainly important, but I would still feel that by channelizing the rivers, taking away all their floodplains, and thinking that agriculture can be done by taking the water away is a misconception, and that is at the root of the problem. The growing population, if it has to be fed, I should also feel what will happen in another 50 years if we have already taken away stored water and removed groundwater for the increase 4 times of population. Our storages are about 50% at the moment, 45% of the total water availability in the country. No, surface water storages, something like 45%. They want to increase it still. How far can we go on increasing this with the rise in population, and how far can we go on abstracting groundwater? When will it end? So that is where the conjunctive use, participatory management, groundwater recharge, everything comes into play. But we should again not forget that water also provides food and others. The food that we take, a substantial proportion of the population takes, comes from the water directly. And even small storages, small ponds of less than a hectare or an acre can provide more food on that land without taking away your land with small amounts of storages of water than people can raise with simple rain-fed agriculture.
Briefly, yeah. Okay, just one thing. I think small is not always beautiful, right? We do say small is beautiful, but it's not always beautiful. So in some ways, small projects can also amplify a lot of inequalities. I don't mean that engineers need to go down and address inequality in the household, but clearly if their aim, and you're a good IIT engineer, I must say, good training to ask these questions. I think project managers obviously need to know that if they are coming into a community, they're going to build on existing inequality. So are they interested in addressing those or not? So I think that's something. And it's not just gender, it's caste, it's ethnicity, etc. And so in some ways, the other thing is I think it must be a very masculinist discourse that has naturalized the fact that women walk hours for water. I mean, why is it that we don't think it's a big deal? And why is it that the global standard is 1.5 kilometers or 1 kilometer? You know, it is an outrage, frankly. Can any of us do it? So I think, there is some basic issue there. The other thing is women, especially in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, more than in South Asia, are the primary producers of food. So let's not forget the huge contribution of women to food production. But they are not really the irrigation managers, they don't have the clout, they're not really available in decision-making processes. So in that sense, I think we really need to reverse that equation and make sure that, you do have women assuming key roles. And finally, obviously, there is this population debate. Most of the water, you can't produce food. You can't have food security without water security and vice versa.
The question of the national water policy. So I'd like to contextualize it in the recent discussion about the water framework bill. So would you say that the water framework bill had put in processes and safeguards that would, in a sense, scrutinize either interlinking or interbasin transfers much more rigorously than anything done earlier?
Should I answer?
Yeah.
Oh, listen. I think, the water framework law, law means it's not a law yet. There are various drafts available. The first one was by the Ramaswamy Iyer committee, which did. Probably that was not palpable to the Water Resources Ministry, so they appointed another committee headed by Alag. And I think now Mihir Shah committee has given another version, which is now under discussion and type of thing. So I think since I was also part of the first Iyer committee and things and going through critically looking at the Mihir Shah committee report, and I think they have enough pointers which is provided that how a decision can be taken on these projects and things. And I think that is the role of the water framework law to some extent, to have an integrated view about many of these things, because otherwise the entire policy legal regime in India around water is so fragmented and things, and sometimes they don't even talk to each other. So this was first attempted to try to integrate some of these things and try to provide some type of a pathway in terms of making decisions, not only in terms of deciding on projects, but in terms of also actual use. There I think both the IR committee report as well as the Mihir Shah committee report does talk about water recycling and reuse as one of the soft options which we need to look into seriously. And I think this is very important when you come to industrial water use and the urban water use. One is because it is much easier to manage in terms of technological management and institutional type of a thing, because the use is much more concentrated, and the whatever you create as return flows is also in a way close. For example, in the agriculture sector, probably it may be a little more difficult to manage. But people have found innovative ways. I mean, in Maharashtra, for example, 30% of the groundwater so-called irrigation is in the command area itself. It's one way of recycling where people do it and things. So I think one of the preconditions should be is that industries, if they are demanding fresh water, probably it should be mandatory saying that they should be able to exhaust all other softer options like recycling, reuse, local water harvesting and type of thing. Then they need, and also making technological improvements. Now, thermal power in the country, which is the highest or largest industrial user, is one of the most inefficient. Even spend a little money of technological innovations and type of thing, you can bring in water use efficiency much more. You can change processes where other type of things are available. So I think we need to look at all these baskets of type of things. So Water Framework Law does provide a window to look at these issues seriously and things.
Professor Mehta, if you could respond to the question of how do we disempower the powerful?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we were talking earlier that in some ways a lot of these issues are really known. You know, this is what are we saying that's really new? Because, you know, people who've been working on large dams have been saying these things for a long time, and it ultimately boils down to incumbent interests that are promoted, questions of power. So how do you challenge that? I think maybe like a pedagogy of the powerful and the rich is something we have to now embark on. It's not just kind of doing development studies to work with the poor, but maybe we need to kind of, you know, really think about how we address the rich and the powerful and get them to have a sort of mind switch. You know, I think that's really important. It's also because there are so many new players around and it's very insidious, the kind of linkages. So in some ways, it's a very, very shrunk, it's a very closed space now. And, you know, now sometimes the only funding that we have is corporate social, what is it, CSR funding? And the kind of social, irresponsibility. So I guess naming and shaming is really important. Naming and shaming, a kind of pedagogy of the powerful and the rich. More alliances, all kinds of creative alliances are required. It's difficult because the media is also very corporate controlled. So I guess, you know, there was a big march all around the world, which was very gratifying. So, you know, more protest outside. I guess, you know, there's all sorts of things. But we have to keep hope because it's very depressing out there right now, even with the leaders that are currently around in the world, all over. So, yeah.
Sharad, can I just add one point to it and just complete this discussion? One small correction to Suhas. I never said that civil society organizations or CSOs are going to be there. I would talk about real politics. I mean, where water becomes an agenda of the transformative politics. Second, I also don't hold the view about small is beautiful type of thing. I agree with what Laila was saying. There are many examples to show that. But coming to your point about this whole domination and inequity and things, I think we need to step out of water for some of these issues. I mean, I don't think all these problems can be resolved within the water sector reforms or what you want to do. In fact, there are a lot of vibrant movements of the Dalits. Why are we not talking to those movements? There are movements of the women's movements or Dalit movements or other type of Bahujan type of a thing. We need to talk to these people and we are not able to talk to them. Neither do they talk to us. So I think this type of a talking, and I think that's what I'm saying, that some of these issues of inequity and historical type of thing has to be dealt with, not within just simply working on water issues, but we need to work on other, exploitation and oppression type of thing, where there are movements which are taking place. I think we need to connect this. Then I think probably we'll get a different politics.
Now you can use the long handle of the tail ender and hit a few sixes. You're the last one.
I guess the winning run has already been scored. So anyway, I think I just have two or three basic points. One is adding to what Joy said. I think answering the question on the water policy, in many ways the Water Framework Bill, essentially it all started with Dr. Iyer, and then I was part of the Mihir Shah committee. And I think, I remember having said this in the meeting as well, that the Water Framework Bill, at the moment, even if it's in a draft stage, is a kind of a proxy for an improved water policy. And I think there is some value in that. So I'll leave it with that question. The second point I have is I'll also add recharge to the recycle and reuse point. And I think especially in urban India, it becomes relevant to look at recharge, recycle and reuse. Of course, it has to be sort of properly looked into. The science, the social elements of that are also important. My third point is about conjunctive approaches, and I think this came up. And so we have experiences on participatory irrigation management. Not good, not so bad, not so good kind of experiences. And I think integrating the concept of participatory groundwater management with participatory irrigation management, which was essentially surface water, command area driven, can be one sort of promising area of work. I'll leave you with a parting shot, maybe a parting six. For me, alternatives that we all talked about are not alternatives in that sense. I think these alternatives are important because they are going to be valuable even if ILR becomes a reality. And I think therein lies the hope for these alternatives. So whether ILR happens or not, I think focusing on these alternatives is going to be the real key in terms of taking this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Himanshu. And on that note of hope, I'd like to thank all the panelists